Everybody's been asking about the Cialdini book, the 4th edition versus the 5th edition. I checked it out. There's no difference. This is a common thing you'll find with textbooks, right, that they generate a new edition gratuitously for really no reason at all. They've done this to you again. I didn't want it to happen. I'm sorry. If you can get access to a used copy of the 4th edition, go for it. The chapters are all the same, 4th and 5th edition, identical chapters. 5th edition, it's newer. It looks better. I think the content is like more or less identical. Hopefully Bob Cialdini doesn't watch this webcasted lecture and get mad at me for messing with him. Bob Cialdini, by the way, is a really cool guy. I had lunch with him last year. This guy, he is his book. It's really weird. Like, you know how that book is like really fun to read and like, you know, the ideas kind of leap off the page? That guy, his like eyes light up as soon as he starts telling you about a study, and then it's like you're in the book. It's really cool. I had a couple glasses of wine with him, and his eyes would light up more and more, you know. He's really cool. And he also has like ethical concerns about the book too. Like he's really like, he has a new book out about influence called Yes, which I'm not plugging here. I'm just telling you it exists. I think Influence is a better book, so I think you're reading the best book. Otherwise, I would have assigned the new book. But he was like describing Yes. He's like, these are ways you can get people to say yes to your arguments. And then he went off like for like 10 minutes on how he was really careful to make it ethical and stuff like that. So he's a good guy, Bob Cialdini. So I hope you enjoy this reading, because I think it's most people's favorite social psych book for the people who take the class. All right. Any other organizational type questions? Okay. Introductions? No? We're good? Okay. The syllabus has been changed. I warned you I would add some readings to the syllabus. I've done that, and a sort of clever bait and switch, you know? Give you a syllabus that's lean on readings, get you to register for the class, then beef up the readings. Ha, 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 you know? So by this time, you haven't attended some class at the same time, so you're locked in. You have no choice. This is how hell works, I understand. So, but in all sincerity, I added some readings. They're really good readings. A few more article readings, no more books. You don't have to spend any more money. So what you might want to do is take the existing syllabus and just tear it up and get a new one, because the readings anyway are inaccurate. The schedule of the lectures, that's still accurate. Okay, so one thing I like to do before every class, when we have time, we won't always have time, is at least briefly review the last lecture. And the last lecture, I tried to fit a lot of material into a short period of time because we're on a schedule here. And anyway, I was talking really fast, as you probably noticed. So I'm going to briefly review the last couple lectures. Okay, so the first lecture, we had kind of two mini lectures in one last Thursday, right? One on experiments, and then the other on self-serving biases. So the experimental lecture, what did we do? We reviewed variables, basic definitions of key experimental terms. Yeah, these reviews are often me just pressing the space bar really fast and annoying you. So I don't know. Yeah, okay. So we talked about two different definitions of experiments, and we defined experiments in terms of independent and dependent variables. And experiments are basically these studies that you create where you manipulate an independent variable to see what its effect is on some dependent variable. And what's the kind of classic example of an experiment, the one that people are maybe most familiar with? Right, the placebo, the medical experiment model where people, yeah, nobody really said this. I'm just pretending like everybody said it. The medical experiment model where they test a medicine and they test the medicine versus some placebo. Why do they do that? They do it because they want to control for everything except the medicine so they can see the medicine's effect. So everything else is controlled. The nurses or whoever's administering the medicine doesn't know if they're administering the medicine or the placebo. In both cases, the patients take a pill, and the only thing that's different is that the placebo has sugar or something else innocuous inside of it, whereas the medicine has like medicine inside of it. And then what's another critical feature of experiments that we talked about and that I spent, well, an embarrassing amount of time making this figure for, was random assignment. And we use random assignment to control for more factors that we would be worried would vary in the experiment, but we want to keep them constant across the two conditions of the study. So we randomly assign people to be in the treatment or the control condition, or the experimental or the control condition, whatever you want to call it, the two conditions of the study. Why do we do this? Because on average, if you do random assignment, all the little individual differences between people that might really matter, like gender or extroversion or depression or what have you, will get equalized between the two conditions. Okay. And one nice thing about a random assignment is you don't even have to know all the variables that might vary, that might affect your dependent variable. You don't even have to know them. You just randomize them away, and you don't even have to know. But for random assignment to work as well as possible, it helps for it to be a very large N study. What do we mean by a large N study? A study with a lot of participants. That's why medical experiments, where they're really serious, they're trying to figure out, is this pill really going to help people with diabetes? And they need, to get approval from the government in order to sell it. They run really, really large N studies. Okay. Then we talked about baking sodas and volcanoes, and I told you a story about my father going bananas. And he did, man. He really did. Then we talked about some biases in the experimental method, or the things you have to watch out for as you design experiments. And then we also talked about some advantages. We showed you this picture of an experimenter, a picture of a baby panda, and I don't know why I did that. I just really like that baby panda. And that was it. Okay. So you need to know all that stuff. Then the next mini lecture that we went through on Thursday was on self-serving biases. And we were sort of jumping forward a little bit because this is kind of a tight, smaller lecture, and I wanted to be able to get one in there. The key idea in the self-serving biases lecture is motivated reasoning, which is the tendency to come to conclusions that make you feel good. And if I was going to make a list of the 5 or 10 concepts and ideas from this class that I really want you to get in order to know social psychology well and in order to really master this class and have good kind of walking around knowledge of social psychology in your everyday life, this would be one of them. Motivated reasoning is an incredibly persistent phenomenon, and it's good to understand it, as well as it's the many diversity of examples in classes of motivated reasoning that we talked about. So we talked about how people handle evidence in a motivated way. What do we mean by motivated? They tend to handle evidence in a way that helps them come to the conclusions that they would prefer to come to. So if you're a Democrat, then you'll tend to pay more attention to evidence that makes Democrats look good. If you're a Republican, you'll pay attention to evidence that makes Republicans look good. And there's a ton of evidence for that at even a neurological level. Motivated group affiliation. People tend to affiliate with their sports teams more when they win than when they lose. That was a study done by Bob Cialdini, actually, in the 70s. Truly one of the great social psychology experiments of all time. Motivated recall. I think I told you about my friend who would always recall facts that seemed to make him look good and make his arguments look good and mine look bad. Very irritating. Self-handicapping. Men do this more, which is interesting. Women make sense. The above-average effect, the unskilled and unaware of it effect, the holier-than-thou effect. I think you're reading Kruger and Dunning's Unskilled and Unaware of It paper for this week. I moved it up to this week because I have no idea why I had it 2 weeks after introducing it in the lecture to begin with. And the Unskilled and Unaware of It paper, which you'll be reading for this week, pay close attention to this paper. This was a really, really famous paper. It was covered in Time and CNN, and Dave Dunning became very famous for doing this experiment because it's super, super cool. Okay. And then I showed you a bunch of quotes, including one from Ice Cube. Okay. So having done all that, let's talk more about cognitive biases, and let's talk about theories of attribution. Are any of you familiar with attribution theories from other social psychology classes you took? I always raise my hand because I obviously wrote the lecture, so I must know. Okay, cool. Okay, so attribution theories. Well, let's start with this. If we're going to talk about attributions, let's talk about the absence of cognitive biases. Let's talk about why people do research on cognitive biases to begin with. And the reason is a sort of history of science reason. In the 17th century, and continuing past that, there was the rise of the Enlightenment. And in particular, Descartes was a sort of critical figure in the kind of growing wave of academics that were doing philosophical work and reinvestigating old questions that the Greeks had talked about. And Descartes is the kind of figure that's most associated with standard models of rationality. Even though other Enlightenment figures after Descartes that are even really more central to the Enlightenment are also associated with it and maybe talked about it even more. But Descartes had this idea that human reasoning is and should be logical. That when we think, we look something like this machine, which is interesting because Descartes was an anatomist, and when he wasn't talking about mathematics and logical reasoning and how we're all very logical organisms, he would actually open organisms up and see that inside it's very messy and gross. And if you read Descartes, you'll find that like 3 chapters after he says, "I think, therefore I am," he's talking about like what the spleen does. It's very, very disgusting. But it's very funny. It's a very interesting insight on like the early years of science, where the same people were anatomists as were, logical, philosophers or philosophers of logic. So Descartes had this idea that human reasoning is and should be logical, and that was part of the Enlightenment view of a clockwork universe. This idea that the universe worked according to logical principles, was consistent, and you could understand the laws of nature and of the individual deductively. That we could sort of say, "I think, therefore I am," and then deduce things from there, because the world was essentially logical. This is this big new idea. And if you're going to start academia, if you're going to start colleges, and you're going to start studying nature, what are you going to start with? Well, you're maybe going to start with math, because math is really useful for engineering. They actually had pretty good math at this period of time. So in a way, they were just kind of trying to take math and extend it. But along the way, I think they screwed up psychology, right? The first take on psychology that the Enlightenment philosophers gave was one based on math and logical relations. So they gave this kind of excessively rational model of the individual that's turned out to be very sticky culturally in the centuries since then. So we find ourselves 300 years since Descartes still with the kind of default model of how people think being that they think logically. And I think you'll find as this class goes on that this default model is woefully inadequate and far from the truth. It may be a useful default model, and then we can talk about departures from it, but we do not think logically and rationally. So what are the characteristics of rational thought? Okay, they're pretty much what you would think they would be, that we are sort of cold, logical, deliberate, we think consciously, we come to conclusions that are logically defensible and reasonable. Now, this model of rationality as the way that individuals think is still very popular in the discipline of economics, where it's still the sort of standard model. And they get a lot out of it. I'm not dissing economics. They get a lot out of it because it's simple. They can state it in like a few propositions, and they can do a bunch with it. So in economics, not only do they assume that individuals think rationally, logically, mathematically, but they also assume that individuals are selfish, goal-directed, and utility maximizing, as in they make decisions to make themselves feel as better as possible at any point in time. Now that's just the economics add-on. Most definitions of rationality don't necessarily involve selfishness or utility maximization. So I'm just throwing that out there so you know how the economists do it. They do it a little bit different. Okay, so that's the big question, right? Did Descartes get it right? Were we done there? Is psychology, social psychology, over in the 17th century? Is it the case that we think logically, deductively, rationally? Sometimes, but usually not. And cognitive biases, what we've been lecturing on starting on Thursday and will continue to lecture on this week and into the week after, are the exceptions to rationality. These are the cases where rationality, that simple theory of rationality just won't do it. Assuming that people are rational, logical, and mathematical is inadequate for explaining human behavior and human thought. And that's a guiding principle of this class. Okay, which brings us to social cognition and attributions, the social psychology contribution to this debate over human rationality and how we think. Okay, so what is social cognition? It is the study of the ways in which we process, store, and remember information about people. So social psychologists, I think I told you before, they like to study how people interact. They like to study groups interacting. They like to study how groups affect people, how people affect groups. And that makes sense, right? They're social psychologists, right? But I think I also told you that one of the dirty secrets of social psychology, and there are many, one of the dirty secrets is that that social psychologists also just study how you think. And you'll find over the course of the semester that, especially when we get to the automaticity part of the class, where it gets really cognitive, that we're not even studying people interacting with people anymore. We're pretty much just studying how people think. So social cognition is an area which we say is the study of the ways in which we process, store, and remember information about people, because that sounds social, right? It's about people, right? But in actuality, it's sometimes just the study of how we process, store, and remember information. Okay, and in this area of research called social cognition, we tend to study exceptions to rationality a lot. And in some ways, that's sort of the template for what gets you published, okay? Like, if you were to submit a paper to a social psychology journal, if I was to submit a paper to a social psychology journal showing that people think rationally, logically, act in their self-interest in situations, I would not just be rejected, they would send a man to my house to kill me. That's how it would work. Because they would be like, you're not a social psychologist, you're a fool, you're a Philistine. Because that's not what we do. In social psychology, in the area of social cognition, we study when that isn't true. And it's kind of ironic because they're sort of saying that when you're not rational, that's interesting and counterintuitive and a contribution to knowledge. But because they publish that all the time, it's almost the case that showing results where people are rational and logical would be surprising and counterintuitive. But anyway, don't get me started. Okay. So in this area of research, we often talk a lot about heuristics and biases. And heuristics and biases is just sort of a catch-all for the real way we think, or the way that psychologists and social psychologists are saying is the real way we think. So heuristics are not, okay, heuristics and biases are very different from this sort of logical, calculated way that the economists and the philosophers have said that we think. Heuristics are sort of simple action rules that you follow in situations. Heuristics, very simple guiding principles that you activate that guide your behavior. Not complex mathematical, logically related calculations, simple action rules. And if you look at people in everyday life, you see often people are following really simple rules for action, heuristics. Biases are sort of errors in the way we think, and I'll give you a definition of that in a sec. Okay. So again, this is a branch of social psychology. This seems weird. This is just about how people think and how they form beliefs about the world. It's not that much about how they interact with each other. But yes, this is a branch of social psychology. And yes, in this class, we are going to indulge in just doing individual level stuff, just how people think and behave and act. And of course, this is extremely relevant to social stuff. If you don't understand how people act, you can't understand how people interact with one another. But we're going to study it for its own sake as well, because the human mind is interesting, and where your behaviors and attitudes come from, independent of social factors, is interesting. Or at least I hope you think so. I do. Okay. So that's social cognition. So what are attributions? Attributions are the processes through which an observer infers the causes of others' behaviors. Now, who are these observers? Who are these causes? What are these behaviors? We're all observers all the time, observing other people's behaviors and trying to infer the causes of those behaviors, be they psychological or social causes. Okay, so at this point, it's useful to talk a little bit about this guy, Fritz Heider, who you'll find I love this guy. It's ridiculous how much I like this guy. Okay, so Fritz Heider lived from 1896 to 1988. He was a psychologist at the University of Kansas, and actually my father was a sociologist. When not going bananas on people who made baking soda volcanoes, my father's day job was as a sociologist, same as mine, and he was at the University of Kansas for many years, and Fritz was a sort of mentor to him and a kind of like grandfather character to me. So there's going to be this ludicrous overrepresentation of Fritz Heider in this class, completely unjustified. No, in actuality, Fritz Heider is considered one of the founding fathers of psychological social psychology because he founded two areas that we're going to review in the next couple weeks, attributions and also balance theory. And we're going to talk about balance theory, I think, on Tuesday. Yes. So a week from today, we'll be revisiting Fritz Heider. And I have a funny personal story. My dad got a different job. This is really self-indulgent. I hope you don't mind. My dad got a different job at the University of South Carolina when I was like 10, and so I moved to South Carolina. And there, I went to school with Fritz Heider's grandchildren, which is really weird. And so I became really close friends with his grandchildren. Total coincidence. I just thought I'd tell you that. So, and they're still around. They're really cool people. Yeah, they're not social psychologists. That's not relevant. Okay. So Fritz Heider came out of European social psychology during this period in the 20s and 30s when they were getting really into this thing called Gestalt psychology. Now, we don't really have time for Gestalt psychology but it's this kind of philosophical school of psychology that is based on this idea that the constituent elements of the brain come together to make something bigger than the sum of the parts. That the mind and consciousness and thinking are emergent properties of the mind. And, you know, that's pretty much an undebatable idea, since if you were to open up a brain, you would see a bunch of, you know, really gross stuff, right? You wouldn't see thoughts and consciousness or anything like that. So they were hip to this idea, and they talked about it a lot. They were very philosophical, and I encourage you to go check out Gestalt psychology. We don't have time for it here. But suffice to say, it was a German movement. It was big in the area of Europe that Fritz Heider was in before he came to America fleeing the Nazis. And they studied the kind of basic rules and principles of perception. And that was something that when social psychologists went to found the area of social psychology, that was their approach. They were like, we're going to study the basic principles and rules of how people perceive other people. And I mean, they made it really, really simple, which is I think, cool. And they just built the whole field from the ground up, from the constituent elements. So when Fritz Heider went to try to answer this question of, how is it that we look at other people's behaviors and infer the causes of those behaviors? How do we make attributions of causality in our social world? When he went to go answer this question, he made this very simple simulation. And I would show you that simulation if my Air Bears worked. So instead, I'm going to show it to you on Thursday. In the meantime, you can look it up on YouTube if you'd like. Just look up Heider, Zimmel. You can look up, yeah, just Heider and Zimmel. And what they did was they made this video, or basically it was a video. I mean, they didn't have video then, so they made it somewhat differently. But they made this video where they took like a triangle and a square and a circle, and they had this box, and they just moved these around relatively randomly, and then they had participants in the study describe what they saw. And the people, when they would watch this, they tended to sort of animate what they saw, right? They'd say like, oh, the square has like a crush on the circle, but then the triangle, I know, it's ridiculous. And the triangle is mean to them and is bullying them, so then they go in the house in order to get away from them, and then they live happily ever after, or something like that. And actually, if you watch it, I think you'll be like, wow, that actually looks like what I'm watching, you know? And so, what does this point to? What does this point to? Why is it that when we look at even just a series of boxes and triangles and squares moving around relatively randomly, we tend to create this kind of narrative, this story, and impute human emotions to these, you know, clearly inanimate objects? Well, it's because we have this strong tendency to anthropomorphize, right? We tend to see the world, see movement in the world in fundamentally social, humanistic terms, okay? Even when we see little things move around, we impute all these human emotions and consciousness. Have you seen March of the Penguins? Have you seen March of the Penguins? And if you haven't, why the hell not? Because March of the Penguins is awesome. But one thing that you'll find is they can't help but anthropomorphize these penguins, right, all the way through it. These penguins are, they say they have all these emotions and stuff, and the narrator just can't help it. Penguins, as wonderful as they are, they don't have emotions like that, you know? They don't have higher consciousness. But we look at penguins doing cute things, and we can't help but think they do. This goes back to an old idea called the pathetic fallacy, which is that we tend to attribute consciousness to even inanimate objects. Essentially, that's the same as anthropomorphizing. And one reason that people think that we have this kind of basic tendency to view objects that way is because it might have been an evolutionarily fit thing. It might have been that as we were evolving, or as proto-humans or some kind of primates before us were evolving, they developed a very careful sense to see in their world when motion and movement is being created by animate versus inanimate objects. And they've done experiments on this property called biological motion, where they'll put you in a dark room, and they'll either have like a machine wave a series of lights around, or they'll have like a human arm wave it. And you know, people are like almost perfect at this test. They can always see when motion is created by an animate object. So, and you can imagine if you're in the jungle and you're trying to survive and you're on the edge of survival, this would be extremely useful, right? To be able to have this like quick sense that motion in your sphere of vision, in your field of vision, is created by something that's alive. Maybe it could kill you, maybe it would be tasty to eat, whatever, or something that's not alive. It's just the wind or something like that. So that's one reason that evolutionary psychologists think we have this kind of strong tendency to anthropomorphize, is we're trying to be very careful and on the lookout for other organisms. But Heider goes in a completely different direction from that with this idea. What he says is, when we look at these boxes, we look at these triangles and all these circles, and we make these attributions, or when we look at people in our everyday life and we make attributions about why they're doing the things that they're doing, we're doing it because we're basically mini psychologists. We're all mini social psychologists. And we're trying to determine the causes of other people's behaviors around us all the time. We're obsessed with it. And in a lot of ways, that's why I find this field of study really interesting. Because I felt like when I came to social psychology, I had kind of the flip of the experience. Like Heider's insight is, lay people are doing psychology all the time. And my insight when I went to take a social psychology class is they're talking about what I'm already thinking about all the time, you know? Why are people doing the things they're doing? That's something I could never get out of my head as something I was fascinated with. But what Heider's saying is we're all like that. We're all mini psychologists trying to figure out why people are doing the things they're doing around us, trying to make the world more predictable and understandable. And that's the reason social psychology is awesome to study, but it's also the backbone idea of this lecture. So, in the literature on attribution that came after Heider, Heider said, you're looking around all the time trying to make attributions, trying to understand the causes of people's behavior around you in everyday life. So in the literature that comes after this, they found two main types of attribution that they kind of categorize. And one is dispositional, and the other is situational. Dispositional attributions are when you, as an observer, or anybody else, attributes another person's behavior to internal states. Now, what does that mean, internal states? Personality, their character, their thinking, whatever. This is when you look at some behavior and you say, that person did that because they're like this, or they were feeling this, or they were thinking this, whatever. And in Heider and Zimmel's simulation, that's what people are doing, right? Even with squares and circles and triangles, they're going, oh, the square moved there because it's in love with the circle, and then the triangle went there because the triangle's really friggin' mean, etc. So what are the other kinds of attributions? Well, there's probably a lot of different kinds of attributions, but in social psychology, we talk about two main types, the dispositional, which I just explained, and then situational. This is the other main way you could make an attribution of somebody's behavior. And situational attributions are when an observer attributes another person's behavior to their environment, or their situation, or their context. And so for example, people don't do this in the Heider and Zimmel simulation, right? They don't say that the square is moving there because of the context, because forces are pushing the square there outside of the square. We don't do that, right? We look at the square, we see the square, and we say the square must be making its own movement. But if you're a sociology major, or if you've taken a lot of social science classes, you know that context, social structure, the environment, the situation really matters, right? And it's not just the case that the reason that you go and do things and your behaviors, the real causes of your behavior are not just inside your head, they're also outside your head in the situations you find yourself in. And we'll talk about that some more. So, any questions? That's all I have. Okay. So, there's this tendency for people to link behaviors and events to stable factors because we want to understand the world, and it doesn't do us any good to understand the world just without guiding principles. We want to understand the world for the future, for projecting the future, for seeing the future, and making the future more understandable and less confusing. So we tend to link behaviors and events to stable factors. And that allows for simplicity, basic prediction, and us to navigate our world. So you imagine how difficult it would be for you to get through a day if you didn't have this ability, right? You wouldn't know whether to touch the stove when it's burning or when the fire's on, because even though in the past you've burned yourself, it wasn't ever that stove at that level of temperature when you're cooking that thing. If you didn't have an ability to generalize and develop general principles about how the world works and how causation works in the world, you wouldn't be able to get through a day without burning yourself, getting hit by a bus, saying really stupid things to your girlfriend, and so on. But because we can develop these kind of general principles for forecasting and seeing the future in the world, because we can make attributions of causality, we can navigate our world reasonably well. But one thing that this leads to, because we're looking for stable, predictable factors, we tend to underestimate situational influences and attach too much significance to dispositional factors. So, and this is going to be one of the big ideas in the class, we tend to make too many dispositional attributions and not enough situational ones. Why do we do that? Because the square is always a square, right? If you can understand the square's movement in terms of the square's wishes, or if you can understand your best friend's actions or words in terms of his or her thoughts and behavior and personality, then you can kind of say, what's your best friend going to do tomorrow? Or what's the square going to do in the next 10 seconds of the simulation? But if instead it's all capricious and guided by just the details of the situation and the context, then it makes the world much less predictable. And we don't like that. We want a predictable world we can understand. Okay, so let's talk about some research on attributions, and then we'll go back to the general ideas. Because if I talk too much about general ideas, then I lose track of what the hell is going on. Okay. So the first research I want to talk to you about on attributions is the following. Jones and Harris, 1967. This is a classic paper. And by the way, if you find this interesting, or if you find these social psychologists interesting, you might go online and look up Daniel Gilbert's essay on Ned Jones. I put it in the optional readings online. It's a cool little article about what Ned Jones was really like. And it sounds like he was pretty nutty. So, okay, Jones and Harris, 1967. What's the purpose of this study? Okay, well, in this study, I have no idea why that keeps happening. In this study, participants were given either an anti or pro-Castro essay. So this is 1967. People are fascinated with Fidel Castro. You guys maybe have heard of this guy. I'm just kidding. Cuban Missile Crisis, 1961. Fidel Castro was this big boogeyman in America, and some leftists were sort of sympathetic to Castro. Many people were sort of scared of Castro and what he meant, because there's this communist country, really close to Florida, and so on and so on. So Castro is this very controversial figure in the United States in the 1960s. And they were interested in doing this study. So they did this study where they gave subjects in the study, brought them into the lab, college undergraduates, much like yourselves, brought them into the lab and gave them an anti-Castro essay or a pro-Castro essay that they were told was written by some other undergraduate. And they were told that the person was assigned the anti-Castro essay prompt and was told, you have to do an anti-Castro essay or else we won't pay you to be in the study. And they were told the same for the pro-Castro essay. So the people who were given a pro-Castro essay were told, this person was told to write this essay. They were randomly assigned this topic, had nothing to do with what their real opinions were. So then they were asked to identify what the writer's attitude was. They say, okay, so read this essay the person wrote, and you tell us, what does this person think about Fidel Castro? So what they found was that when the essay was clearly, even when the essay was clearly assigned and the person had no choice over what topic they were going to write on, people tended to make correspondent attributions. In other words, they tended to make attributions that the person's attitude corresponded to the essay they wrote, that their attitude was correspondent to their behavior. And that's what we mean when we talk about correspondent attributions. We're saying that you're making an attribution that the person's attitude is in line with their behaviors. So in this study, people, you're sitting there, you're reading this essay, somebody wrote a pro-Castro essay, you make a correspondent attribution, this person must support Castro. Even though you were told the person was randomly assigned that essay prompt and had to write it. It doesn't make any sense, right? It doesn't make any sense to make this conclusion, but people did. Does this make sense? Well, it doesn't make sense. I know I just said that, but you understand what I'm talking about. Okay. And this is one of many studies in the history of social psychology where the researchers kind of stumbled on this principle of human nature by accident. What they were trying to do was show the opposite was the case, that when people had the choice of what essay they were going to write, then people would say, oh, you must support Castro or not support Castro. And when they were assigned the essay prompt, then people would say, oh, there's no difference. I don't know what they think of Castro. They had to write this essay. But what they found instead was that people make these correspondent attributions, that people infer the causes of others' behaviors in a much simpler and less sophisticated way than the researchers had anticipated. And this is one of the great sort of stumbling on the truth moments in social psychology, because this experiment tells us a lot about our tendency to make dispositional attributions when we should make situational ones. What would be the right conclusion to come to in this situation if you're a subject in this study, if you want to get it right? The right thing would be to say, I have no idea what this person's attitude is towards Castro, because they were assigned this. The situation made this essay, not the person. But what did they do instead? They assumed that the disposition did, that they wrote the essay because of their attitudes towards Castro. Question? How do you control for the actual essay? They didn't actually have people write the essays. They wrote the essays themselves and then lied to the subjects in the study. There weren't really other people that wrote the essays. So they were like, oh, no. No, there weren't really other people. They wrote these essays and then told subjects this person had a choice or didn't have a choice to write this essay. When they're told the person didn't have a choice, you shouldn't assume anything about their attitude towards Castro. But instead, they assumed that the person who wrote the pro-Castro essay supported Castro significantly more than the person who wrote the anti-Castro essay. Okay, other questions? Yes? Oh, the subjects in the study probably had an opinion about Castro as well? What's that? Sorry? Oh, yeah, I don't know what their attitude was towards Castro. That's a good question. Jones and Harris, I have no clue. I don't know. But I think they set up the study so that it could be anything, right? It could be pro-life versus pro-choice attitudes towards abortion. It could be different attitudes on nuclear disarmament, different views towards China. You know, it could be anything. And the point is, if you're assigned the essay, or here's the point, actually, it's that if you're a subject in the study and you're told that the essay assignment was thrust upon the person, you shouldn't make any assumptions about what they really think. Okay. So here's another study on attributions. I like this one better. So this was conducted by Lee Ross et al., who were social psychologists at Stanford University. Yes, I apologize for even bringing it up. Boo, 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 boo. By the way, I do ask that every time I say Stanford that you boo and hiss, and I'm actually not joking about that. Yeah. Okay, good. Well, this time's fine, but then next time let's make it count. Okay, so Lee Ross and colleagues, they did a study where they were also interested in situations where you ought to be making situational attributions, but people tend to make dispositional attributions because they overdo it with the dispositional attributions thing. So in this study, what they did was they had participants in the study be randomly assigned to be a questioner or an answerer or an observer in this sort of quiz game study. So back in these days, back in the 70s, these quiz games on TV were, I was going to say more popular than now, but I guess they've just been really, really popular all the way through, going back to the 50s and stuff. Have you all ever seen that movie Quiz Show? That's a kick-ass movie you ought to see, in my opinion. Okay, that's irrelevant. So they assign people, everybody's sort of familiar with how these quiz games work. So they bring people in the lab and they're like, we're going to run a quiz show, game show thing, and you've been randomly assigned to be the questioner. Or you've been randomly assigned to be the observer, or you've been randomly assigned to be the answerer. And the people who are assigned to be the questioner, they're told, make 10 questions to ask the answerer, and make them difficult but not impossible to answer. You know? So people would ask stuff like capitals of countries that were like a little bit obscure, but they happened to know the answer, but they didn't know like all the capitals in that continent, for example. So like tough questions, or questions about sports or something like that. They're tough, not quite impossible. And then they asked these questions to the answerer while the observers watched. And the answerers tended to get like 4 out of 10 right out of these questions on average, because the questioners, you know, they made it pretty tough. The questioners actually, when Lee Ross talks about this research, he says the questioners kind of threw themselves into it. They sort of enjoyed making these difficult questions that made the answer look really dumb. So what they found was that then they asked the people, who's smarter in this situation? You know, the questioner or the observer? Like, who has better trivia knowledge? Now, what kind of conclusions should you come to in that situation? Like, what's the logical conclusion? Yes? Who knows? Exactly. We don't know. They were randomly assigned to the positions. Randomly. The person who was assigned to be the answerer, the coin could have flipped the other way. They would have been assigned to be the questioner, and they would have looked really smarty pants. Okay? The person who's randomly assigned to be the questioner, they could have been the answerer, and they would have looked really stupid. That's just how it works. But that wasn't the way people made attributions. Probably most interesting in this situation is what did the observers think, right? Because we're interested in how do people who are observers, observing other people's behaviors, how do they make attributions in everyday life? Well, the observers tended to say, the questioner is really smart. My God, that guy knew all this stuff about the world, and the answerer only knew 4 of those 10 things. Clearly, the questioner is smarter than the answerer. And they were there when the coin was flipped in the air. They know that they should know that there's no difference, but they don't. They don't figure that out. A little bit more complicated is the attitudes of the questioner and the answerer, so, which I almost hesitated to even put up here. So the answerers also tended to think that they were dumber or less knowledgeable than the questioner, which is kind of weird because they're kind of have a motivated reasoning not to come to this conclusion, right? If motivated reasoning is right, they should, you know, not come to this conclusion that they're dumber than the questioner, but They did. And then surprisingly, the questioners did not come to that conclusion. I guess the questioners were sort of like, well, I made those questions really friggin' hard. I bet the answer could have done the same to me. So they came to the more reasonable conclusion. But the point of the study is the observers didn't. The observers decided that the questioner was smarter than the answerer, even though they saw the random assignment happen. Question?
Were the answers and the observers aware of the instructions given to the questioners about making questions?
Yes. Were the answerers and observers aware of the instructions that the questioner got? It's a complicated question. It's a good question. Yes, they were. Everyone knew the same instructions. Instructions were done in front of everybody. Excellent question. So everybody had common knowledge in this situation. They should have been able to figure it out, but they didn't. By the way, this happens all the time with Alex Trebek. I don't know if you all like to watch Jeopardy. I love watching Jeopardy. I tried out once. I didn't make the cut. Oh, well. You can try out now, I think, online, by the way. I got past the first round, and then I went to New York and I became very humble very quickly. Alex Trebek, people do this all the time, right? People think that he's like the stereotypical smart guy on television, right? Why the hell would you think that? Why would you think that? Why is he the stereotypical smart guy on TV? He has all the answers. He doesn't even write the questions. They give him the answers. It's ridiculous. But without fail, people worship this guy as some kind of paragon of intelligence and academic knowledge and stuff. It doesn't make any sense. He has all the answers. He doesn't even write the questions. They're handed to him. They're handed to him. I'm not saying Alex Trebek is dumb. I'm not saying that, because he's not dumb, probably. I don't know, but that's the thing. I have no idea how smart this guy is. And another thing I'll say about Alex, if you're going to download this webcast and you're watching this, he can be very rude to people on the show. He can. Right? He's super rude. It's ridiculous. Watch this show carefully, and he'll totally correct people. He'll be like, no, that's not how you pronounce Kilimanjaro, And he'll do that. He'll get these little bits in, and you're like, man, you didn't even write that question. They handed it to you with phonetic pronunciation. But anyway, so I'm a big fan of the Will Ferrell spoof because I think it's very, very fair. Okay. Okay, so biases and attribution. And this is, I think, the best idea yet in the class. Yes, I'll say that like over and over and over. But I really think this is the best idea yet in the class, is the fundamental attribution error. And the fundamental attribution error is the strong tendency, I've already been basically saying what it was, the strong tendency to overestimate dispositional factors and underestimate situational factors when you make attributions about others' behaviors. That's a long sentence, but it's pretty simple, okay? It's the tendency too much to say this person caused their behavior, not the situation they found themselves in, okay? So we tend to attribute other people's behaviors to their personalities, to their character, some kind of stable, enduring traits of that person that made them do what they did, and we don't attribute to the context of their behavior. So what are some examples of this? Well, the examples are the ones I basically just gave you, the 67 and 77 studies. People ignore that the pro or anti position on Castro was assigned to the writer of the essay, right? They ignore the situational information, even though the situational information entirely determined the content of the essay. The person had no choice what essay they were supposed to have written. And instead, they tend to make dispositional attributions and say it's because they wrote this because of how they feel about Castro. So they ignore the right answer and go with the wrong answer because of the power of the fundamental attribution error. Another example is the quizmaster answerer role assignment. People assume the quizmaster is really smart because he knows all 10 questions, right? And they assume the answer isn't so smart because he or she only knew 4 of them. Does this make sense? No. They should know that the person is randomly assigned to one position or another, but they forget about that. They lose the situational information, focus too much on the person's disposition. Okay. A related idea to the fundamental attribution error is the correspondence bias, which is basically just the tendency to do dispositional attributions. It's not an error per se. Well, no, it is an error. Okay, so the correspondence bias is an incredibly related concept with a slightly different definition. I'm only giving it to you not to confuse you, because they're really similar ideas, but to be thorough, because people talk in social psychology all the time about both these things, and if I'm going to teach you an upper-level social psych class, you should get this. So the correspondence bias is the tendency to assume a correspondence between people's behaviors and underlying attitudes. So the correspondence bias is part of the fundamental attribution error, because this is an example of the correspondence bias. and so is this, right? In both cases, there's a correspondence bias. But the fundamental attribution error goes a step further and says we tend to do the correspondence bias even in situations where we ought to take account of the situation. Okay? So the correspondence bias is the tendency to make dispositional attributions. The fundamental attribution error is the tendency to make dispositional attributions even when you ought to make situational ones. Sir? Right. All of this applies to the perception of the self so far. Not, oh, sorry, oh, why did I say that? To the perception of other people, not to the perception of the self so far. We're about to talk about how you make self-attributions in a second. So, good question. Yes, question. Yes, all this is as an observer. That's why I was kind of like, don't pay that much attention to the questioner and the answer here. You know, for the Ross et al. 77 study, we're focused on the observers because we're still thinking about how you, as a mini social psychologist, how you make sense of the world and make attributions and what the kind of rules of the game are for that. Okay, so let's take like a 2-minute break and then we'll come back. Well, don't go anywhere. Sorry, we'll take like a 2-minute break and then we'll continue the lecture. Okay, if we can get started. Okay, if I get your attention, please. If I get your attention, we'll get going again. Okay, all right, we're back. We're back. All right, cool. So, oh, shoot, I don't know why I put this up and then. Okay, so one thing I wanted to remind you about is this assignment, and I got email. Oh, that's terrific. It's wonderful. I'm sure you all wanted to know about that. Okay, so there's a short writing assignment that's due this Thursday. Don't forget to get this in. I don't know why it's due Thursday. This is such a short, easy assignment. I should have made it due today, but I didn't. So there you go. So get this turned in on Thursday. We'll turn it in on paper in this class. Please bring it in. Keep it short. Don't let it be longer than 2 pages double-spaced. I think I told you that one of the guiding principles of this class is that you just show up for life and you do at least pretty darn well. That's one of the guiding principles of life, as well as this class, and especially this assignment. I mean, you just do this assignment properly, and you'll get full credit. Okay? I mean, I don't know how you could half-ass this, but please don't. We don't want to give you less than full credit. We would love to give you full credit on this. It's a kind of didactic exercise where I want you to go through this thought process, go off on this person you had a conflict with, and yeah, and then we'll do a follow-up assignment as well. Okay, so there's that. Get that in on Thursday. That's not what I wanted. Okay, so, right. Okay, so I got the Heider and Zimmel demonstration, or at least I think I do. No, that's not good. Okay, all right, there it is. All right. Okay, this is awesome. Okay. So watch this and see if you can help making attributions. It's weird. It kind of reminds me of like the Miss Pac-Man demonstrations and stuff, where like they meet, they fall in love, you know. But you know, okay. So what? Just for a second here, like what gender do you think this one is, and this one, and that one? Right. So we all have the same. They're circles and triangles, right? That's great. Some people are like, "You guys are crazy." Those are all women, clearly. Yeah, so, I mean, it's a powerful demonstration, actually, in its own way, right? I mean, it's really just a bunch of triangles and circles going around, a bunch of boxes and squares and stuff, and yet we all pretty much all agreed on, like, the gender. I have this whole narrative that was going on. Yeah, what do you got? What's your question? You thought the little triangle was a woman, the circle was a kid, and you thought, what do you think the big triangle was? Oh, man, okay. So you thought that the triangle, regardless, the size was like gender or something like that? Or you thought that nothing about the objects communicated gender or something? But still, and of course, your interpretation is equally right, you know, definitely. But I mean, like Heider would love this, right? He would love that even where we disagree, we're still talking about the triangle being a person, and the other triangle being another person, and the circle being a child, and stuff like that. So even small disagreements are pretty small disagreements, yes. I think they did, yeah. So the person made it on purpose to look like people, sort of. Yeah, no, I agree with that. I agree with that. But they could be animals. I don't know. They could be, I don't know. I think Heider's still laughing in his grave, like, haha, I got you again. I think it's still interesting the degree to which we anthropomorphize them even though it's not shocking that we do it at all. I agree. Yeah, so I'm with you. I'm with you. Okay, so back to cognitive biases. All right. Okay. Go to slide. Okay. So I just finished telling you what the fundamental attribution error was and telling you that I thought it was really awesome. Hopefully you will come to agree. Then also told you what the correspondence bias was. Correspondence bias is they're heavily overlapping ideas, right? Correspondence bias is the tendency to make dispositional attributions. The fundamental attribution error is the excessive tendency to make dispositional attributions and not make situational attributions. Very similar ideas, but I wanted you to have them both. So what are some examples of the correspondence bias? When you get angry at a secretary or a service worker or somebody on a customer service line, it's not their fault, right? It's not their, it's just their job. They probably have scripted most of what they're supposed to say to you. They're just reading it. They're just trying to make a buck, it's their job, and yet you can't help it, right? You can't help but get angry. And you should hear my version of getting angry at like service workers, like I'll be like, I know this is just your job. I know you have to do this to make a living, but it's a bad company. It's a bad company you're working for, So I struggle to not make the correspondence bias while still getting irate and angry at the person. And I'm sure that they notice the difference, right? Yeah. So you shouldn't do this, right? Or you should try not to do it because that person doesn't want to tell you the bad news. They don't want to tell you that you can't use your frequent flyer miles in this way, or you can't return this product to their store, or you can't get your financial aid application processed on time. The reason I bring that one up is I used to be one of these people. I used to answer phones for the financial aid information line service or something like that. So when you call 1-800-4-FED-AID and talk to somebody who you think is an awful, awful person who's trying to keep you from having financial aid, I promise you they're not. I wasn't. They want you to have financial aid, actually, and there's simply nothing they can do. Everything they say is scripted, and as you say things, they're like flipping sheets and going, okay, I say that, either mentally or physically. They're flipping through scripted answers. So don't get mad at the people at 1-800-4-FED-AID. I had so many terrible, it was such an awful job. Actually, at the time I was working there, the company I was working for was paid to process all financial aid applications and all phone calls related to financial aid applications. And they had just privatized this. It used to be government jobs that were well-paying with pensions and health care. And then they got a bunch of us temp workers, and we worked for $8 an hour, which was good money then. But so they got us doing this, and they had this contract that was if you process all the financial aid applications, your corporation gets this much money. But for every one you don't process, we'll dock it, some amount of money. So what they did is they get to the end of every month and they wouldn't have processed all the financial aid applications, and they just start throwing them in the garbage. They just throw out people's financial aid applications and not report them to the government, and then pay people like me to have to field all these calls, unaware that that's why these people were irate that their financial aid wasn't being processed. It was bad, 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 bad. As soon as we figured that out, we quit the job pretty quickly. But we were very poor. Okay, so we were very poor. Okay. It was a terrible, terrible job. Other examples of the correspondence bias, blaming the messenger, right? You shouldn't get mad at somebody who brings you bad news. Why do you? Why do you get upset with them? Because you're making a dispositional attribution that they're somehow responsible for the news they're giving you. But really, if they're the kind of person that tells you bad news when you ought to know it, you should, if anything, make a benevolent or even nice attribution to them. They're breaking the news to you, right? Or, for that matter, praising the messenger. People tend to do this as well. They give they give somebody a big hug for telling them some good news, oh, this is so wonderful. It's not the person, it's the news, right? You're making this dispositional attribution. So don't be nice to people who give you good news. Don't do that. That doesn't do any good. That's just irrational. And you can tell them I said so. Or a very sociological example would be this. Are kids that are from wealthy school districts intrinsically better students? Or do they have intrinsically higher aptitude than kids from worse school districts? Or is it the case that they went to school districts with fewer resources to invest in them, less opportunity to develop their academic and scholastic talent? Is that maybe the attribution you should make? And think about what attribution do we make when we find people who have literacy issues or have different levels of education? What kind of attributions do we make? Maybe we should balance the dispositional attributions we make with situational ones as well. But people usually don't. And this actually relates to Malcolm Gladwell's new book. Has anybody got this book to read this book? I haven't read it yet. But he has this new book. Malcolm Gladwell's always doing these books on sociology or social psychology or psychology. He's this very good writer, nice guy, great hair. And Malcolm's new book is called Outliers, and it's all about these extreme cases of success Hey, can you guys stop talking on the front row right there? Thanks a lot. It's about these extreme cases of success. And basically, he says success comes down to this equation. That we tend to think it's all talent equals success. The really talented pianists become great pianists, you know. The really talented academics become great academics, or basketball players become great basketball players. But it's not. It's not. It's talent plus work, great effort, and then opportunity. And the big thing he's importing from sociology is the critical role of opportunity. It's when your talent and your hard work finds its spot, finds its chance, that you can then be successful. And that is a great equation for life. Okay, so what are some more biases in attribution? Well, here's one, the actor-observer bias. This is the tendency, this is another big one, this is a big one, you gotta know this. This is a tendency for us to see our own behavior as a product of the situation, but other people's behavior as a product of their internal states. So now we're making a shift from, you're not just an observer, you're also observing yourself. And when you observe yourself, how do you infer the causes of your own behavior? Well, you tend to look out to the world and see the world, right? Whereas when you look out to other people's behavior, you see them. Right. So the mechanism is focalism. That's the mechanism. Okay, so what makes the actor-observer bias? The tendency for you to see the situation as causing your behaviors, but people's personalities and dispositions to cause their behaviors. Why do we do that? Okay, focalism is the answer that social psychologists have provided us. And this is the tendency to overestimate the causal impact of whatever we're focusing on. So when we view others, what do we see? We see them. We see the triangle or the square, or we see our best friend saying something, you know, mean to us or giving us bad news. So we make a dispositional attribution because we see them and we go to look for a cause. That's what's available to us. That's what's in the center of our field of vision or our perception. That's what we're focused on. But when we go to look at our own behaviors and we look out of our own eyes and we try to say, why did we do that? What do you see? Well, you see the situation you're in. You don't even see yourself. And they've actually shown in studies that people will do this bias less if there's a mirror in the room, because it facilitates them seeing, oh yeah, I am a person, I am a thing that could have done this. It's not just the situation. So focalism is so strong that we even sometimes attribute the behavior of inanimate objects to their personalities, right? That's what the Heider and Zimmel illustration is all about. That's what March of the Penguins is all about, and so on. So that's how focalism creates the actor-observer bias. Is this understandable? Is this clear? Okay. It's a great idea. I think it's a great social psychology idea that because your eyes are located in your head and you can't see you, but you can see everybody else, you tend to see them as causing their behaviors, and your situation and other people as causing yours. What's that? Okay. All right. Okay. Some other actor-observer biases. So think about how you interpret your own case of all these versus other people's cases of these, right? Cheating on a test. If you were to cheat on a test, would you better friggin' not do in here? You'll get in a lot of trouble. But if you were to cheat on a test, what would you do? You'd say, you would say, well, I had to. I was in this desperate situation. I had a low grade. It was very easy. That person's, test sheet was sitting right there. It's really hard not to look at it. That's why you did it. Other people cheat on a test. They're a bad person. That's why they did it. They're a bad person. Going to the prom alone, not that you would ever do this, not that I would ever do this. I wouldn't even know I don't know why you would go to the prom alone. It's just a crazy example. But if you did, you'd probably be like, well, I'd already asked this one person. I just had this terrible breakup with this person. I think people like me, but, it's the situation I was in led me to go to the prom alone. Other people go to the prom alone. They're a loser. Okay. Doing poorly in an athletic competition. I stayed up late the night before. It was a uniquely difficult field of competitors. You think about the situation you're in, right? You really do. If other people do badly in some athletic competition, it's because they suck. This always happens in sports matchups. People will think about the talent of one team, and they don't think about how winning or losing is a function of the talent on both teams, right? So if Cal loses some competition, they think, oh, Cal is good or bad. They don't think Cal is, might have had a tough opponent. And of course, every time we lose, it's because we had a tough opponent. So making $1 million. You make $1 million, you do so because of great effort and work ethic and discipline and intelligence and talent and drive. Not opportunity, of course. Other people do it, it's because they inherited it. It's just some kind of unique opportunity they had. They're not even smarter than the average person. Lying to your parents. You would do that because you had to. It was this awful situation you were put in. You had to. It's the only thing that made sense. It was in your parents' best interest as well as yours. And when other people do it, they're a bad person. firing someone. You know, if you ever find yourself as a manager, you have to fire somebody, you're like, well, if I didn't fire that person, I would be fired, right? Somebody fires you or fires one of your friends, they're a terrible, despicable boss, terrible person. Why do they do that? So here's a good exercise, and really do this for me, hypothetically in your brain. Think about a behavior, not two, let's just focus on one. Think of a behavior that you're very critical of. Like everybody's hung up on something. Maybe cheating on a boyfriend or a girlfriend you think is some horrible moral transgression. Maybe, I don't know, like making fun of people, like bullying, maybe cheating on tests is something, lying to parents, lying to your brother, whatever. Think about some terrible behavior. Some terrible behavior that when other people do it, you really make a dispositional attribution. You really say, that person is a bad person, because bad people cheat on their girlfriends. Okay? So take that behavior. Now think of some situation that could make you do that behavior. Just think about it. Just for a second, try to think of, is there a situation where you might find yourself doing that? Okay? And there you go, right? But you're not going to conclude that you're a terrible person. It's just that there's a situation whereby you could do the things that you would be even most judgmental of. There's probably a situation. There might have to be alcohol. Think about it, you know. Like there's a situation you would do it. Or think about the worst things that you've ever done. Like think about, I mean, this is not a fun exercise, but like think about the thing that you've done that you know that is truly terrible, you know. I mean, really awful. I should have done this one first, not to leave you with that one. But think about something terrible that you've done. Now think about how you judge another person if you found out that they had done that, you know? You'd think they were bad. You'd think they were a bad person. Why is that? And why is it that you would judge that other person to be bad, but you would account for you can still live with yourself and you don't have some terrible vision of yourself? It's because, I would say it's because of the actor-observer bias. It's because you know when you did a terrible thing, it was because of the situation you found yourself in, but you think when other people do terrible things, it's because of their personalities. Okay. So there's still more wrinkles. We still have 3 minutes, so calm down. There's still more wrinkles to how attribution works. Motivated reasoning. We already talked about motivated reasoning. That's the tendency to come to conclusions that make you feel better about yourself. Another way to think about it is convenient reasoning, when people tend to come to conclusions that make them feel better. So people do motivated reasoning in self-attributions as well, right? So far I've told you a story of the fundamental attribution error, the correspondence bias, and the actor-observer bias, right? And that story was basically that correspondence bias. We tend to make dispositional attributions of other people's behaviors. Fundamental attribution error. We tend to make those dispositional attributions even when we should be making situational attributions. Actor-observer bias. We don't do that for ourselves. We tend to make situational attributions for our own behaviors because our focus, our perspective of attention sees the situation we're in very readily. But motivated reasoning has something to do with all this too. So while we generally take account of the situation when we infer the causes of our own behavior, we tend to take credit for the positive things and make dispositional attributions for them. Okay? And we deflect blame for negative things by making situational attributions, and aren't we clever like that? So what am I talking about? So I'm talking about, when you talk about these bad things or whatever, well, they're not all bad, you know, these things, here you'll make situational attributions if you find yourself doing these. But great things, like the making $1 million is a great thing. There you'll tend to make a dispositional attribution if you make $1 million. Okay? Okay. So let's see if we can find another example. Okay, so let's go through this. So let's say you see someone do something, you make a dispositional attribution because you see them doing the thing. She or he did it. Okay. You do something good, you make a dispositional attribution because you want to claim credit for it. Okay? This is motivated reasoning added, overlaying the actor-observer bias. Okay, so I did that. Great. You do something bad, you make a situational attribution. I didn't want to do that. I had to do that. I had no choice. I wasn't planning to do it. It wasn't my idea. It was the situation. It was Dixon's idea. I mean, we all have some friend. My friend is Dixon, who makes you do all the things you're not supposed to do and gets you in trouble with your parents. My friend is Dixon. He has led me into many, many, many terrible circumstances, none of which are my fault, mind you. They're all Dixon's, and this is my friend Dixon. Should you run across him in everyday life, do not trust him. He will get you in trouble with whoever cares about you most and lead you to terrible, terrible things. So how should you attribute? According to sociologists and social psychologists, you should rely heavily on the situation, the context, and we'll talk about that more on Thursday. Thanks a lot.